And so the nature of leadership then is defined a little bit by the particular challenge that people take up. So we understand leaders in terms of the challenge that they're trying to address. So if you have children that are young at school age and you're trying to influence schools, obviously the leadership backdrop to what you're trying to do is young people, schools, get a life relative to education. If the child's older now and is a young adult or something, then there'd be a different set of challenges, work, leaving home possibly, things like that. If it is that people are trying to transform services so that services are more useful, then that would be service-related leadership. Similarly, if it's at the level of values, then you would have leaders that are providing values-based leadership based on some kind of something that's important to people. For instance, a very good example of that would be respecting the voice of people with disabilities is a huge challenge because people want to essentially ignore people and their voice and not take them into account and just do for people or do to them. So whenever you oppose that, you're providing leadership for a different vision, which is that it's more natural for people to be in charge of their own life, and there's no reason to suspend that simply because the person lives with some kind of a disability or an impairment. And the moral reasoning behind that's very strong. This is why it's very appealing from a values point of view, and that is that everybody's impaired. There's really no such thing as disabled people because everybody has limitations and impairments, things that you can't do. And so in that sense, there's no class of people called disabled. There is culturally, but in reality, everybody has impairments and actually may even develop them if they don't have them now, additional impairments. For instance, a lot of impairments come with age. So the older you are, the more likely that some impairments will develop. So the fact that you can't do something doesn't necessarily mean anything. What's really important is that people enjoy the lives they have and find fulfilling lives. So that involves all kinds of leadership, helping people get fulfilling lives, and leadership at a what might be called a micro level, very tiny level in society, but it can have enormous significance. So you'll see, for instance, from time to time, a particular family that's done something that is inspiring and courageous and difficult, and they've achieved something, and yet that can have a knock-on effect for everybody that comes across the example. Why? Because they draw strength from what the other family has achieved. So the family that did something provides a kind of role model at that point for others, a precedent, and also experience that can be drawn upon. Well, that's leadership. But there could also be another form of leadership, which is faithful imitation of leadership. In other words, to follow in the footsteps of people that have broken ground is also leadership, and it would be called early adoption leadership, that you would be one of the first to step into the footsteps of others. And a good example of that occurs to me a lot is there's a parent I've known for a very long time. Her name is Nicola Schaefer. She lives in Canada, in Manitoba. And her daughter, Catherine, would be considered one of the most disabled women in Canada. She's just turned 50. So that gives you an idea of Nicola's age. And over 30 years ago, Nicola decided that, well, she really wanted a good life for Catherine. She had been wanting it for some time, but one aspect of it was Catherine should get a chance to have a home of her own. This was a sort of values decision, and yet her daughter would be considered profoundly intellectually disabled, nonverbal, very physically disabled. So people would look at Catherine and say, "You've got to be kidding. This woman's going to need 24-hour care for the rest of her life, blah, blah, blah. So where did you get such a strange idea?" And so Nicola got such a strange idea because she said, well, my daughter is first and foremost a person like everybody else and can want and benefit from the same things anybody else might want, so why can't she have a home of her own if lots of other people have homes of their own? And using disability as a justification for not having that was just simply not on. So Nicola, you know, and others around Nicola and Catherine all kind of figured out a way for, you know, Catherine to have a home of her own. And to make a long story short, she's been several decades now having a home of her own that she owns, actually. And there's very little that happens in her home that she's not really the key decider about. People say, well, how can somebody like do that? Well, you know, with a little assistance, you can, you know, she's very opinionated. If you knew Catherine, she has very sort of clear ideas about many, many things. And like the rest of us, can be quite vague on other things that aren't important to her. So with Catherine, she's, you know, kind of moves between being very definitive and other times not so. But she has lived on her own with support for several decades and would be considered significantly disabled. Well, obviously, if you go back then 30 years from now to when you would have had the gestation of the idea that maybe Catherine could do this, if it's 2012 now, you go back, that would have been something like 1982. And think where people's minds were in 1982. Catherine, or Nicola, would have been quite a ways ahead of the curve, really. So she really was providing leadership. It wasn't like everybody that had a child with a significant level of disability like that, you know, had this vision that, oh, she can have a normal life. But Nicola did, and eventually wrote a book about it. And that book became quite influential, as did the example of Catherine. And some years into this, a woman from Canada, another woman, Alison Ouellette, who had a son who also was very significantly physically, intellectually disabled, David. She was inspired by Nicola, and so began to think about David and what David would have when he became an adult. And you know, in the foreword, she also wrote a book then about David when he did get a home of his own. And in the foreword to the book, you'll see reference to Nicola. That Alison always thought that Nicola was sort of the starting point. Her example was the starting point for her thinking about David. So you see how one bit of leadership from Nicola spurred another leader. Because in fact, even when Alison took leadership around David's situation, she was still ahead of her time. It wasn't like it had become commonplace. So she was still kind of pushing the boulder up the mountain a little bit herself. This is the nature of leadership. It builds on other leadership that has come before it, and it also becomes the pathway for other leadership that will come after it. So leadership can be thought of as a series of personal initiatives through time as people tackle a challenge and so on.